the war in Ukraine is not going to get resolved as an interpersonal conflict between Putin and Zelensky, right? Hamas, although it's been pretty well decimated by the IDF, still, whoever they are now that are running Hamas, they have to maintain solidarity with all of their followers. And if they get too far ahead of their followers, they get their heads chopped off.
Happy birthday to you.
Being here, I appreciate that. It means a lot, and I really am mostly curious on your experience going from being a lawyer to being a peacemaker, and more specifically, what a peacemaker actually even means. Because, I have my idea, but I'm sure it's a little bit different.
Sure. Absolutely. So the journey started in the mid-1980s, in my mid-30s, when I took up the martial arts. And I became a secondary black belt around my 40th birthday. And at that time, my teacher said, "I'm not going to teach you anymore. You're an arrogant asshole. You're going to hurt somebody." And he said, "You got to go study Tai Chi and learn Tai Chi." Well, Tai Chi, as it turns out, is probably the oldest martial arts, and it's the foundation for all martial arts. And the other thing that's really interesting about Tai Chi is that it's extraordinarily deadly. Most people think of Tai Chi as being the forms, the katas, but when studied as a martial art, it's a completely different game than what most people think. But in Tai Chi, there are two paradoxes. The first is the softer you are, the stronger you are. And the second is the more vulnerable you are, the more powerful you are. Soft to be strong, vulnerable to be powerful. And I didn't understand these paradoxes in the beginning, being a hardcore trial lawyer and a secondary black belt and big guy. But eventually, with practice, these concepts seeped into my soul, so that one day in the late 90s, 96, 97, I think it was, I was trying a case and cross-examining somebody, and the thought came to me, what the hell am I doing in here? So I finished that trial and then went on vacation on a river trip up in Idaho, whitewater trip, and spent the week thinking about how many people I'd really served as a trial lawyer, and could only count 5 people over 20 plus years that I'd really served. I said, I'm not going to do this anymore. But I didn't know what I was going to do. I was a major partner in a large Central California firm, second largest earner in the revenue generator in the firm, had a stellar reputation as a trial lawyer. And so the idea of doing something different was intriguing, but no path seemed to be open to me until I came home from that trip. And I was driving down out of the mountains to my office when I heard what turned out to be the one and only public service announcement for a new master's degree in peacemaking and conflict studies being offered at Fresno Pacific University, which is a local private Mennonite university. And the Mennonites are one of the 3 traditional Protestant churches. I didn't know anything about the Mennonites. I knew the Fresno Pacific existed. I didn't know anything about the program. But to make a long story short, I enrolled and was accepted. And for 3 years, I was a full-time master's degree student, a 3/4 time law professor, and a full-time trial lawyer. And that's how it started. And my teachers completely twisted me around. I mean, I learned things that I had never even conceived of before, and saw that there were ways of looking at human conflict that allowed us to intervene in those conflicts without litigation, without fighting and arguing and that sort of thing. And so ultimately what happened was that I had many discussions with my partners who were very unhappy about my change, as you might imagine, seeing the golden goose stop laying the golden eggs. And ultimately, we couldn't come to agreement, and I was given an ultimatum on a Friday, and that Monday I walked in and said, I quit. And I walked out at the end of the week and never walked back. And that was in November of 2000. And so November 1st, 2000, I opened my peacemaking practice and began a life as a peacemaker. So that's how that started.
Yeah, that's quite the story.
Yeah, that was just the beginning of the journey, though.
So just before we go too much further down that path, and I do want to get back to those two principles of Tai Chi because I love both of those. I do want to just formally make it clear what actually is a peacemaker as opposed to a lawyer. Is it peace in terms of relationship? Is it litigation? Like, what does a peacemaker do in a nutshell?
Well, that's a great question. Peacemaking has a lot. It's a loaded term. It's got a lot of baggage around it, which I'm well aware of. And it's got some religious overtones, spiritual overtones. The Colt 45 Peacemaker, it's got violent overtones. And the way I describe it today is what I help people today, what I do 22 years, 24, 25 years later, is number one, I teach people how to never have a fight or argument again in their life using a very specific set of unique skills that I've developed that you will never fight anybody ever again. Two, if people are engaged in a conflict, then I'm engaged as a mediator to come in and help them calm down, de-escalate, and engage in problem solving or negotiation to one, end the conflict, and two, make sure the conflict does not arise again. And I can do this in the context of litigated disputes where people are in a lawsuit represented by lawyers. And I can do it in the context of a non-litigated dispute where maybe lawyers are involved and maybe they aren't. And those kinds of conflicts would be stuff like family business conflicts, conflicts over estates, trusts with heirs fighting or beneficiaries fighting, hedge fund managers in a fight with the founders of a company they've invested in, stuff like that, where litigation is not a good option. Congregational disputes, where of all different faiths and types, where people are arguing over new liturgy versus old liturgy, that sort of thing. And these are all relationship based that the law is poorly equipped to deal with. And yet with the appropriate skills and knowledge, somebody like myself can come in and facilitate dialogue and problem solving so that people can get out of their locked positions and find a way forward to resolve their conflicts in a not always amicable, but certainly effective and efficient manner.
Yeah, I love that. I'm going to have to do some more research on peacemaking. I love the concept of it because, I think conflict and communication are really two things that walk together side by side a lot. In that most of the conflict that occurs is just things that are poorly communicated or people are not open to hearing something else other than what they believe themselves. A good friend of mine goes by the saying that conflict is typically either misplaced love or misplaced fear. And I'm interested by that because, I think in a lot of cases, either it's a love that you are not willing to open up and share, or you are maybe idolizing the wrong thing, like yourself rather than the result, finding a resolution that works for both people, or a fear of, hey, what could happen if things don't go my way? So I'm going to stand firm in the position I am rather than being open to hearing resolution. Do you see any common threads with the kind of arguments or conversations that conflict that you deal with?
Well,
not necessarily just to misplaced love or misplaced fear, but just in general.
There are all different kinds of conflicts. For example, you can have interpersonal conflict, which I think is the type that your friend would be talking about, where people become emotional around something and then they can't communicate and they break down and become reactive and start fighting. That would be a form of interpersonal conflict. You can have group conflict, which would not fall within that definition. You can have, and group conflicts can be as simple as two groups in a community in a disagreement or fighting or maybe even being violent with each other. Or you can raise to the level of insurgencies within countries, which we see a lot of around the world right now, and all the way up to actual countries at war with each other, as we see, for example, in Russia and Ukraine. And all these different conflicts all involve people, but the cause of the conflict and the ability to find peace depend upon vastly different variables from type of conflict to type of conflict, and different skill sets from conflict to conflict. The war in Ukraine is not going to get resolved as an interpersonal conflict between Putin and Zelensky, right? It's a different kind of animal. But on the other hand, if you've got a congregational dispute, for example, or a family business conflict, those are deeply interpersonal. And so the kinds of things your friend is talking about are probably, you would use a different set of skills and insights to helping people get through those conflicts.
That does make a lot of sense. I'm wondering is there some level of similarity between these different levels when it comes down to a willingness to communicate or a willingness to hear the other person's side?
Absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, conflict is about human beings, and human beings have to listen to each other, be willing to listen to each other in order to ultimately negotiate out some sort of resolution. So all levels of conflict have that in common. There are, as the conflict level complexifies, it gets more and more complex, because oftentimes, for example, if you look at say you've got an insurgents conflict, let's take Gaza, for example. So Hamas, although it's been pretty well decimated by the IDF, still the people whoever they are now that are running Hamas, they have to maintain solidarity with all of their followers, and if they get too far ahead of their followers, they get their heads chopped off. So oftentimes you have conflicts within the organizations that are in conflict with each other, and you can see this publicly in the Israeli government. Huge conflicts within that government, and getting everybody unified with looking at a goal or goals that can bring people together then becomes very difficult. Oftentimes you have to mediate in different groups themselves to help them get focused on what is most important to them. And so but it's still interpersonal, but it's just very complex interpersonal conflict.
So now, obviously we're not going to solve that conflict within the confines of this podcast, right? But to boil it down as simply as possible, what would a first step in a conflict, not obviously to that level, but let's say you have some interpersonal conflict.
The first step is people have to want to end the conflict. They have to be motivated to end the conflict for one reason or another. And that's true at all levels. So until people have a motivation to come to the table and talk and negotiate, nothing's going to happen. And at the Israeli level, for example, one of the reasons why the Palestinian-Israeli problem has gone on unresolved for 40 or 50 years is because there are cowards on both sides. In order as a political leader to engage in peace takes a huge amount of courage. Huge amount of courage. And Netanyahu was a coward, and the people who were running Hamas until they were all killed, they were all cowards too. Afraid of peace, afraid that they would lose their power position and privilege from their followers, or the people that kept them in power, if they engaged in any kind of discussion around peace. And that's the first element. You may not believe that peace is possible, but you have to be willing to at least entertain the idea that sitting across the table from your enemy might be productive. And that's a huge problem right there. Mm-hmm. No, you need to have both sides. Ultimately, people have to come together. And if they don't agree to come together, then it takes two to tango or more, depending on how many people are in the conflict. You got to have all the parties there.
Yeah, so that makes me ask another question. Let's bring it back to interpersonal, just for the confines of like the audience here. If two people are engaged in a conflict, whatever it might be, whether that's family or business, and one person is willing to come to the table to seek resolution because it's a misunderstanding, whatever it is, but the other person is adamant that they're set in their ways, they don't want to find resolution. What does someone do in a situation like that?
So what I do is explain, if I can get in front of the non-consenting party or parties, it's all about choice. And I say there are only 4 ways to resolve a conflict. One choice is by coercion, where one person tells the other person what to do. And the only way coercion works is if there's power over. Somebody has sufficient power to enforce their will on somebody else. The second way that you can resolve conflict is to go to outside authority, where you give up your power to resolve the conflict and you give it to a third person, which could be a judge or a jury or an arbitrator or some other outside decision maker who will decide for the parties how the conflict is going to get resolved. In that case, you have no power to decide the conflict because you've given it up, or you've been forced to give it up because you've been sued, for example. The third way that you can resolve conflict is through the peacemaking mediation process. And that's where the parties agree to step into the power circle. And they have, as a group, have the power to decide, 1, will this case resolve? 2, or the conflict resolve? 2, if so, under what terms and when? They have all that power, and they bring in an outsider, somebody like me, to facilitate a process to allow them to have those conversations. That's the most empowering level. And then 4, there's negotiation, where the parties, without the use of a mediator, try to negotiate a resolution, and it almost always fails because they're in the conflict because they lack a lot of very deep emotional skills to manage the strong emotions that conflict evokes. So what happens in most of the time is people try to negotiate a conflict. One person says, shove it. Then they run up to coercion. So they hire, in the case of a litigated dispute, they would hire lawyers, lawyer up, file a lawsuit that moves them into outside authority. They spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in attorney's fees. And when the attorneys have made enough money, the judge says, go mediate this case. And that moves them to number 3, mediation, peacemaking. And of course, what I advocate is if your negotiation fails, find a mediator and go there directly. You don't have to go through coercion, outside authority, and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to eventually get to a mediator. You can go to a mediator directly. So when I'm talking to somebody who is involved in a conflict, and I say, which of these 4, number 4 is not working for you. Negotiation hasn't worked for you. Of these 3 choices, which one makes the most sense to you? And almost every time they say mediation, because they recognize that in mediation, they maintain their power. But if they go to coercion or they go to outside authority, they lose power. They lose the power to shape the resolution of the conflict. So it's really just understanding your choices. And when people are resistant to resolution, it's because they really haven't been presented with what their real choices are and the consequences of those choices.
Right. Or really understood what those are, right? They may be sort of set in their ways and think, hey, this is not going to end the way I want it to if we talk. So I have to go through this way to, coerce my will to be done.
Right. Although that's illusory. Because unless one person has an enormous amount of power and can tell the other person to shove it, they can't force their will on anybody. And if they have to go to outside authority, they don't have any power because they've given it all up to a judge or a jury or an arbitrator. So this idea that I can force you to do what I want, well, maybe you can, maybe you can't, but that would be coercive, and coercion has some heavy costs associated with it.
So now I'm curious, how does that play into what you talked about earlier about, never ending up in conflict or losing conflict? How does that relate, or is there some secret sauce that maybe you want to share a little bit?
If you do not want to ever have a fight or argument again, there is a way to do that. And that's what I teach. That's what I coach. People hire me to teach. And basically, it's learning how to listen to and reflect the emotions of others instead of their words. I say, calm any angry person by ignoring what they say. And you're going to basically learn how to listen other people into existence. And when you do this, the brain scanning studies show that the emotional centers of the brain that are now highly activated become inhibited, while at the same time, a part of the brain called the right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex is activated. So our executive function comes back. People calm down typically within about 90 seconds. And now they can engage in problem solving or negotiation. So the way you stop fights and arguments from occurring in the first place is by learning how to recognize an emotional statement and reflecting the emotions rather than going into your own positioning and posturing and persuasion. And that's the secret. And that's a skill that has to be taught, learned, and mastered.
And I imagine a big part of that would be your ability to sort of remove yourself and your need to be heard, to be able to listen to the other person and mirror them back.
To a certain degree, that's correct. However, I found that most people, when they learn this skill, become empowered. And so their need to be heard is not nearly as strong as it used to be, because they're empowered to listen to somebody else and validate them and make this other person's emotional experiences be heard and validated. And that is a profound and transforming experience. I learned all of this. I've spent 10 years in maximum security prisons here in California and also in Connecticut, training people serving life and long-term sentences these skills to stop prison violence. I've taught thousands and thousands of inmates these skills. And, the transformations in their lives are just absolutely phenomenal. Here in California, we've had 700 of our students who completed our program, which is a year-long program, released on parole, and we've only had one person reoffend out of 700 people.
Wow. So just to clarify that, because I want to make sure I heard that correctly, you've sat down with 700 people in prison who are facing up to life in jail, had conversations with them, and then gotten them to not only be open to this conversation, but essentially to master these skills?
Yep. Taught far more than 700. We've had 700 lifers released. And of everybody else, we've had thousands released, but very low recidivism rate. Less than 1/10 of 1% of the thousands of people that we trained. And we train them how to be mediators and peacemakers in prison to stop prison violence. And the reason we were working with this population was because we figured they'd be in there for a while, right? And so they could continue to work in their prison communities and not only teach people how to do what they do, but also be there to stop fights and arguments and violence. And it's extraordinarily successful.
That's honestly mind-blowing. I never considered the fact that, A, that was even a thing. So huge honor and thank you to you for doing that, because I'm sure that's likely a scary scenario to step into these conversations with people who, maybe you're not necessarily sure how ready they are to accept this conversation. But I think it's also a huge testament to your ability to have those conversations and find resolution that's in your favor.
It was a little intimidating in the beginning, but once we got used to the environment, we being the team, once we got used to the environment, that was no problem whatsoever. And we found that our students were intensely loyal towards us and intensely interested in learning these skills. What I learned was that people in prison, especially if they're there because of violence on the outside, violence is the only language they knew. It was what they were not born with, but what they grew up in. I'll never forget asking, I was working in Corcoran State Prison, about 100 feet from Charles Manson's cell. And I was asking my students, I said, so tell me about what was the dominant emotion in your family growing up? And one guy said, the only emotion in my family was anger and rage. Any reason? Of course, anger and rage, of course you're going to go to prison. That's all you know. If all you know is violence as a form of conflict resolution, then what are you going to do? If somebody disagrees with me, you're going to pull a gun and shoot them. And that's how these guys were. But once we showed them that there were far more effective ways of stopping fights and arguments and resolving conflict, far more effective than violence, they just left violence. Said, we don't want anything to do with this. We know now how to do this. And that's why they became powerful peacemakers inside and when they left prison, became powerful peacemakers outside in whatever communities they were released into.
Wow. Talk about a redemption story. That's amazing.
Yeah, thousands of redemption stories.
Wow. That's honestly amazing.
That's the power of the work. Really, it's they did the work, but we were able to give them these skills, train them in these skills. They mastered the skills, and they transform. And it happens every single time. Every single time I have to take on a client and teach them these skills, their life is changed forever.
So, are there other things that we'll call, for lack of a better term, a side effect of going through this process? Where initially I said, hey, the authenticity part, where they're comfortable with who they are, so they're not trying to please that ego and pride. They're open to listening. Are there other things like that go through this?
Sure, your emotional intelligence grows through the roof. You develop deep cognitive and affective empathy. You are able to walk into any situation, no matter how intense, and know exactly what to say and how to say it, and know exactly what's going to happen, and with utter complete confidence and compassion. And there's just nothing that anybody can do that will throw you off balance, because you know exactly what they're doing and why they're doing it and how to fix it, what to do with it.
Are there scenarios where, I don't want to ask this question, are there scenarios where that backfires, where let's say you come into a scenario where the other person is acting emotionally, or what the reaction is going to be, and they get triggered by, oh, you just think you know what I'm going to do, and that sort of go backwards? How does that not happen?
Our brains are hardwired for this. That's why these brain scanning studies are so powerful, is that we have evolved, as our human brains have evolved in a way that our brains will automatically de-escalate. And we can't stop ourselves. We can't help ourselves. So if I de-escalate you, Jim, you could be as mad as you want to be at me, but you'll be calm in 90 seconds, whether you want to be angry or not, and you will not be able to maintain your anger. Now, there are times, and this is something that we were always taught inside prison, and I don't have this problem outside so much with my clients, but inside, we always told them, if there was any chance of violence, walk away, get out of there. Don't mess with it. And he said, you just don't need to do that. So it depended, a lot of it. I've never heard of a situation where one of my incarcerated students was faced with imminent violence. Although they have stopped gang riots, and they have stopped rapes, and they have stopped assaults. They've done a lot of really cool stuff like that. But where the violence was directed at them, I've never heard of any situation where that occurred. But we direct them, walk away. If there's an immediate threat to you, walk away. Don't come back at it another time. Not right now.
That's amazing. So to go back to what you said earlier about in Tai Chi, where the softer you were, the stronger you were, the more vulnerable you were, the more powerful you were. Do those two principles play a part in this? Or I'm very curious to how that works, if you could expand on that, because I see a lot of, we'll go with masculinity, that is tied to being loud and proud, or there's ego and pride that just exudes from people, because they think, hey, if they're soft or they show some emotion, it shows weakness, and then they can't have that.
Utter bullshit. It's utter bullshit. It's a myth that has been perpetrated on us for 4,000 years, and it's wrong. And it's also extremely abusive. We've been taught by philosophers and theologians that what makes us different from other species of animals is our capacity for reason and rationality. Well, it turns out that there's no such thing as rationality. There is no definition of rationality. It's a word out there, but nobody can give you it. I'm not going to put you on the spot, but one of the things I do with my graduate students is, okay, give me a definition of rationality. What's it mean to be rational? And if you go on Google or ChatGPT and ask for a definition of rationality, you're not going to get it. It's a mythical, meaningless word. What we know from neuroscience today is that human beings are emotional. What makes us human are our emotions, not our critical thinking ability. And so all these men who've been brought up in this very toxic male culture, the way you described it, are suffering because they're afraid of emotion, because they've never been trained in how to be emotionally competent. We have the same problem in the prisons, both in the women's prisons that we worked in and the men's prisons. But once we taught them these skills and they became emotionally competent, they were even more powerful than you can possibly imagine, because they were whole human beings utilizing their emotions in an extraordinarily powerful and transformative way. So when I hear about the things you're talking about, pride and ego and being tough and the rugged individualist and not letting them see you sweat and emotions make you weak, what I see is really somebody who is very fearful, very scared, lacks confidence, and will resort to violence because that's all they know. And they're generally ignorant of a higher, better way of being.
So what I'm hearing you say there is it's more like they are afraid of their own emotions, or they are not in control of their own emotions.
And it's because probably they were raised in an emotionally unsafe environment. They were emotionally invalidated as children. They were told not to feel, or to only feel certain emotions and not other emotions. They were never trained how to become emotionally competent. Their parents were anything but emotional coaches. And so they looked to peer pressure and to role models, most of whom were all poor. And they picked up these ways of thinking that are devastating. It's devastating on them physically. It's devastating on them mentally. It's devastating to relationships. And they're passing it on to their children because they don't know any better. So it's devastating to their children.
And in that household, it's normal, right? So they don't know better.
And it's not normal. It's abnormal.
So then how does someone break that chain?
Learn these skills. Just learn this very simple set of skills that I teach. And once you learn these skills and start practicing, it takes about 8 weeks to learn the skills, to really master it. Once you get it, all of this changes. Everything changes.
It feels very similar to when you said before about people being open to seeking resolution. It seems like the person has to be open to seeking resolution with themselves.
Well, I think that's correct. You have to be willing to grow and change. If you're not interested in growing and changing and developing and having a totally fulfilling life, if you don't want a fulfilling life, you don't want to grow and change, you'd rather be stuck in this myth because it's comfortable, it's what you know, then yeah, of course not. But it's not difficult to learn these skills. And it's not hard. It's not painful. It's like learning how to ride a bicycle. And once you learn how to do this, then it just becomes part of you and you just naturally grow and change. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to go to therapy. You don't have to go meditate for 20 hours on some mountain somewhere. Your brain will actually grow and change as you learn how to listen to somebody else's emotions and to reflect those emotions. And you don't have to do anything else. And just over a period of time, usually months, the transformation will take place.
Is there a scenario where skills like this could or should be taught in school?
Absolutely. Every teacher should be taught these skills and how to use them. And every school administrator should know about these skills and how to use them. I work with a guy, I've been working with him now for 3 or 4 years. He's a school teacher in Louisville, Kentucky. This year he's teaching 8th grade science kids. And these skills he uses them all the time. And he says it completely changes the lives of the children that he works with. Because for the first time in their life, they feel heard and validated.
Now, what about for the students themselves, right? Not even talking about the educators or the administration, but
The thing that's cool about kids is once you start listening to them in this way, you don't even have to teach them how to do it. They'll just pick it up and start doing it on their own, usually within a couple of weeks. And that's what Jim is noticing in his classroom, is the kids are now listening to and reflecting each other's emotions in the classroom. And it's completely changed the dynamic of the classroom.
So let me ask you this, because it feels like a timely question. With the current state of our society is fairly contentious right now, right? We've got a lot of people who are believing one way or believing another way. And there are people who are very much stuck on, hey, my side is right, your side's awful. Is there a practical tip to have that conversation or open up that conversation when you get to someone who says, the typical, they're just going to vomit everything that they heard and your side's awful, right? Where does that conversation, how do you start?
So you start with recognizing that whenever somebody makes an utterance that has a political nature, let's say it's around abortion, around immigration, around guns, those seem to be the hot topics these days, that whenever somebody opens their mouths and makes an utterance, that they're engaging in an emotional behavior. And so you ignore their words and pay attention to what their emotional experience is. And then you tell them what their emotional experience is. So I'd say, so Jim, you're really pissed off. You're frustrated. You're angry. You feel completely disrespected. You don't feel heard. You feel like you're invisible. And you feel completely unappreciated, unsupported. And you're feeling a lot of anxiety and worry and concern. And you're deeply offended and nauseated by what you see around you. And you feel a little bit of shame and humiliation because you don't know yourself how to manage this. And it makes you sad and depressed and unhappy. And at the end of the day, you feel like you've been completely abandoned, rejected, and betrayed. And you feel completely alone, unloved, and unlovable. Now, you're not experiencing any of those things, but what did it feel like?
So, two things I noticed there. One is, again, even though we were not actually having this political conversation, I certainly did feel a disarming feeling, right? So there's a soothing effect to it, if you will, where it feels like you're being taken down a notch.
So, in any kind of conversation coming up in the holidays, and people go to politics, the moment that somebody utters something around a hot button issue, recognize one, it's emotional, and then reflect what their emotional experience is. It's going to be anger. There's going to be frustration. There's going to be a feeling of disrespect, a feeling of not being heard or understood, and anxiety. Even if you just got those three levels, you can calm people down.
I think a big part of that is resisting the urge to come back at them with your own.
Exactly. You don't have to. You don't have to come back. I don't have to convince you of anything. Why do I need to convince you, Jim, of my political beliefs or wherever I stand on an issue like abortion, guns, or immigration? Why do I even have to do that to you? Why do I even care?
So, my theory on this, I'm assuming you'll support it, is everyone's got 4 basic needs to be loved, appreciated, seen, and heard. And I think that in these conversations,
and when people feel heard, all the other needs get met.
And I think in a lot of these situations, you're coming up against 2 people who do not feel heard in a scenario.
And want to be heard. And so why do they start shouting at each other?
They want to be heard. And meanwhile, neither one is being heard.
That's right. And so their brain, they just naturally start to get louder and louder and louder to get the other person to hear them. And then the other person interprets that loudness as an attack. And so they counterattack and get louder themselves. And pretty soon they're at it. And all you have to do is listen. Listen to what they're feeling. Hey, man, you're really angry. You're pissed off. You're really frustrated. You feel completely disrespected. Nobody's listening to you. You don't feel heard. You feel ignored. And you feel unsupported. And it's really making you anxious and worried and concerned. And you're sad. You want connection. You want to be connected with people, but it's not there, making you miserable and upset.
So what I'm hearing you say there is, if one of the 2 people can take a moment to not hear the words but hear the emotion, it can disarm that other person, and you can actually have an intelligent conversation.
That's right. The fight will never take off. And that's how you stop fights and arguments forever. And once people calm down, then you can engage them. So, for example, I teach people to ask 4 questions when you're engaged with a person who's politically polarized. Question number 1. So, Jim, I'm curious. Tell me about all the life experiences that you've had that lead you to the beliefs that you hold today. How did those beliefs come about? And you're going to tell me your story, and I'm going to listen to you, and I'm going to affect labeling. I'm going to listen to your emotions and reflect. Then my second question is going to be, so Jim, how do your beliefs serve you? How do they help you in your day-to-day life? And you're going to tell me, or not, and I'm going to affect label and listen to you. Jim, what do you do when you are confronted by somebody who has a radically different belief than you do? How do you manage that? And you're going to tell me what you do, and I'm going to affect label and listen to you. And then finally, so Jim, I'm curious, how should we as a society manage all of these different beliefs, some of which are polarizing, exactly opposite? How should our society deal with so many different belief structures that come into opposition to each other? How do you think we should be organized to handle that? And you're going to think about it and tell me, and I'm just going to affect labeling. I'm not going to take a position on any of this stuff. But by the time we're done with those 4 questions, you will find that you will have far more in common with this person that you thought was off the deep end than you could ever possibly imagine.
A, I agree with that. It makes a ton of sense. And B, my immediate question there goes to just the thought that the person who is doing the receiving end there has to be heard at some point. So there's still a need for them to be heard, that I think if they are heard first, they're in a spot where they can now sit here and not vomit back opinions, but do some listening as well.
That is one of the great challenges that I tell my students and my clients that come into my coaching sessions. I said, one of the things you have to understand is that there are very, very, very few people who can do this. In fact, nobody can do it unless they've been trained by me, because I'm the only person in the world that teaches this stuff. And so unless it's one of my students whom you happen to run across, you are not going to, your need to be heard is not going to be fulfilled by people around you until you have done it enough and model the behavior that people start modeling the behavior back because they're imitating you. Or you give them a copy of my book, or you get them into training or whatever, so they get to do it. And I said, so that's why, I'm here. If you need to be heard, you get on a call with me and I'll listen to you and make sure you feel validated.
Now, I tend to imagine those people, it sort of becomes easier and easier over time to get those little maintenance doses, right? Because you've started to establish this authenticity of yourself. You know who you are. You're maybe a little bit less
reactive, correct? And you learn how to affect label yourself. So, I'm really pissed off right now. I feel so disrespected. It's really frustrating. Nobody's listening to me. I don't feel heard or appreciated. And I'm worried and concerned and anxious. I'm really pissed off. Just affect labeling yourself like that calms you down.
Wow. That's a mind-blowing skill that I believe if people would take the time to start learning even the initial part. Could you imagine what our society would look like in 5 years of this?
It would be completely, I ask that question all the time. It would be completely different. And here's the thing, Jim. We can't count on our, quote, political leaders to lead us in this direction. This is something that has to happen within each of us. We all have to say, I'm tired of the bullshit. I'm tired of the polarization. I'm tired of people trying to protect their power, position, and privilege by fear-induced arguments. I'm tired of all that. I want to be able to listen to my neighbor. I want to teach my neighbor how to listen to me. We may not agree on everything. We probably won't agree on everything, but at least we can listen and validate each other, validate our experiences, our feelings. Doesn't mean I'm going to validate the beliefs, but I can validate the fact that we're all emotional beings, and we can validate the fact that we all have emotional experience.
Yeah, it also sort of makes me think about, when you look back at our current political climate and sort of how we got to this, I think a lot of those people who are now so frenzied about their side's view is because for a long time they did not feel heard. So their political candidate came in and made those people feel heard, and now they've rallied behind them. So they finally feel like, hey, someone hears me, they see me, I want more of that.
That's true. And the unfortunate thing is that from the political leaders did not hear them. Could care less who they are. I don't care which side you're on. Could care less. The political candidates have one goal, and that's to gain power and remain in power. And they'll say whatever they have to say to get people to feel like they've been heard.
Sort of off topic, maybe not. Did you see the Jake Paul versus Mike Tyson fight? Did you follow that at all?
I only heard about it. I didn't see the fight. I don't own a television set, so I don't watch television.
Hearing about it, though, I think is enough, because I was thinking about this the other day. Leading up to the fight, they had their press conferences. They talk smack about each other for 6-8 months, however long the promotion was. They make these jokes about each other. This person's the worst. That person's the worst. They have their fight. The minute the fight is over, they give a big hug. They say how much they appreciate their opponent. And you sort of start to think about how much a lot of that was promotion, how much they are rallying their own individual camps against the other party to build momentum, some hype. And it made me think a little bit about our past political season, how we have this season for 6 months or more where all you see are these political ads. Hey, my opponent is the worst because my opponent does this or that. My opponent does this or that. The election happens. Suddenly those beliefs are gone. You no longer really feel that way about this person. You're shaking hands, you're taking pictures, you're doing all this stuff. Hey, good campaign. Let's now move forward. And it makes me think about, when as a society do we start to look at the fact that maybe these are one and the same. The promotion going up to this big entertainment boxing match and the promotion going up to a campaign feel very similar to me. There's a lot of smack talk, and then all of a sudden, once the big payoff happens, everyone's friends again.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to that. But there's also a lot of people who believe the smack talk, and that becomes the reality. And that becomes difficult, because then they become even more entrenched in the belief that they're right and the other guy's wrong, and creates more conflict and more polarization. Better not to have the smack talk at all.
Of course, yeah, and I would love, a society where instead of having 8 months of campaign ads where it says, "Hey, the other person's the worst," maybe we talk about, "Hey, here's what I want to do for you." Now, no need to mention the other side at all, but win on your own merit, not because of someone else's deficiencies.
Or here's what I understand. As I go around the country listing, you are feeling, and validate the people they're talking to. So these are the opportunities that we have.
Well, and I think, so that brings up another question here, because I was wondering a little bit about this. Could it be used for evil or harm?
Great question. When Laurel and I developed the curriculum for the Prison and Peace Project, that was the number one question we asked ourselves. We know how powerful these skills are. Could we be walking into a prison teaching people skills that could be used for manipulation or evil or something? And then we found out that it's absolutely impossible. Can't do it, because the skill won't work unless you're authentic. Unless you truly want to listen to somebody, you can't fake it. And if you try to fake it, the speaker is going to sense the BS and shut you down.
Now, is that on a one-to-one, or is that still one-to-many? Because I'm thinking back to, now if we look at this from a political view, how these people felt seen and heard finally, so they rallied behind their candidate.
They thought they were being seen and heard, but they really weren't.
So were they manipulated is the question.
Yeah, but they weren't. But I think they were manipulated, but I also don't think that they were being truly validated and heard. I think they were being manipulated. They were hearing what they wanted to hear. They were hearing whatever they wanted to hear, and that soothed them on the inside, but it did not calm them down, and it did not validate truly who they were.
Sort of feels like it's just enough to get them that little tease of feeling seen and heard, but because they've been ignored for so long, that little tease felt like the whole payoff.
Yeah, it was like giving a thirsty person a bottle of water in the desert.
So then, sort of it's our job to continue this conversation to get people to understand what it genuinely feels like to feel seen and heard and loved and appreciated, so they can start to discern the difference between those two and have authentic relationships.
That's exactly right. It's exactly right.
I love that. So we're nearing the end of our conversation time here. I would love to ask you, not that I don't think you've given me 45 answers to this question already. So thank you again, because the work that you are doing, the work that you've done already is incredible. And to be honest with you, when this conversation is over, I'm going to go do some studying on my own of this exact topic. And I'm sure that we will have another deeper conversation on this, because my mind is absolutely blown. All that being said, if there were one thing that you can give as a bit of advice for someone to have a slightly better day today, one practical tip, one thought process, one item where you can say, hey, if you do this, here's how you can start to live a better day. What might that be?
So I would tell you to pay attention to the positive emotions around you: happiness, joy, excitement, love, satisfaction, contentment, peace. Pay attention to those positive experiences. And every time you see somebody exhibiting that, even in the slightest bit, call it out, saying, you're really happy. When I teach, I say that you start practicing this in a super safe environment. You walk into Starbucks and you place your order and you look at the barista and say, hey, you're really happy today. And you're going to be right 100% of the time, because Starbucks hires people who are happy at 6 a.m. in the morning, right? But just watch for it. If you got children, you got a child, hey, you're really happy right now. If you got a spouse or a partner, hey, you're really happy right now. You're content. And just call out one very small little instance of positive emotion and watch what happens. I'm not going to tell you what's going to happen because you need to discover it on your own.
Yeah, I have a pretty good idea how that's going to work, but I'll certainly give that a go for a couple of days and see how that looks. And again, this has been absolutely mind-blowing, and I can't thank you enough. How can I/we support you and learn more and continue this conversation after that?
The obviously being on different platforms like this podcast is, the more people that hear about this, the better. I'm the only person in the world teaching, other than the people that I've trained, how to train in this. So it's a very small group of people who are trying to teach people in these skills. I've got a book, my 4th book, called De-Escalate: How to Calm an Angry Person in 90 Seconds or Less. You can get it off Amazon, or you can go to my website, Doug Noll, DOUGNOLL.com, and get the book, read the book, because it lays out all the principles and how to do it with lots and lots of examples. That's the easiest way to get into this. You can go to my website. I've got over 250 articles, blog posts that dive into this in every possible imaginable way. I've got a YouTube channel, The Power of Emotional Competency. I've got, hundreds of videos up, all different ways of affect labeling, listening to emotion, different concepts. You can reach out to me by email. I'm a sole practitioner. I don't have a big staff. I don't have any staff. You're looking at him. Doug, DOUG, at DougNoll.com. I answer all of my own emails, and reach out with a question or a comment, or how you might want to engage me differently. I do online webinars, private and public. I do a lot of coaching and teaching. People hire me to coach and teach. So that's how I make my money, and whatever resonates. So there are lots of different ways to get more, learn more, and promote the work. And I would say learn the skills, read the book, maybe take one of my online courses, learn the skills, and pay it forward.
Doug, this has been an absolute honor. And again, I literally cannot express enough how quickly that hour went and how mind blown I am, and how I can't even wait to listen to this back myself just to rehear the things that we just talked about. I, for one, will certainly be doing a bit more research. So again, thank you, and huge honor to you. I greatly appreciate the work you do and the man that you are. It's paying off dividends that you'll probably never see. The little multiplication of relationships that are going to come from all the people that you've touched through this process. It's almost inconceivable. So again, just thank you.
You're welcome. My honor.
Appreciate that.